that's the role of the United States Congress.
Thank you, Dave. And Josh?
I'm amazed that our forces are still in Iraq, and I think they should come home immediately. Iraq is not a nation. It's not a country. It never was. Iraq is an amalgamation of different tribes, ethnicities, and linguistic groups, all of whom have serious differences with each other and have for at least 1,000 years. Iraq was created at the end of World War I, and the West has tried to prop it up and keep it in its current form since then, and it's a disaster. We went from having a madman to having a mad situation. Really, we should get out and let the Iraqis figure out whether they want to live in the north as Kurds, and in the east as Shia, and in the west as Sunni, and in the south as whomever. We can't get into that level, and it's going to require that level of involvement to really make it work out. And we're losing too many people, too many fine young people, and it's costing too much money. Afghanistan, to me, is even more of a ridiculous situation. Here we are allowing the government to continue to grow its official policies to allow poppies to be grown for heroin, for the international heroin. And yet we're out fighting the Taliban in the mountains, and we're losing some of our best, finest young men. These are no-win situations. We need to pull back. We need to find bases from which we can project air power and rocket power and intervene on an as-needed basis. But our time there is over. We were attacked. We had every right to fight back. We've made our point. It's time to get out.
Thank you, Josh. This time we're going to shift to the area of the economy. What personal fiscal principles do you hold, and how do you intend to transfer those principles into a national economic policy? And we'll begin with you, Frank.
I'm a certified public accountant, which is basically a way of saying that my children always ask me for more allowance, and at the same time I'm more than happy to provide it, but we live within our allowances. And the reason I say that is we need to have a federal government that goes on the diet. My personal financial principles are you have to live within your means. You know, I say this because in my life I've been very significantly affected by that. My dad died when I was 3 years old. My mom, a wonderful woman, raised 5 children. My sister was only 6 months old when my dad died. And I had to see firsthand what happens when someone goes into debt. And debt's a slave master. And one of the things I often tell people, if you ever want to see the dangers that happen to a society, dangers that happen to families, watch what happens when they lose the options because they're so much in debt that they can't make ends meet. You know, we have a situation in Pennsylvania right now as an example. Electric rates are going up 30 to 45%. Property taxes are going to go up significantly to cover unfunded pension liabilities as well as other costs. Young people that are in this room are going to be paying into Social Security, but I know you're not going to see it, and so do you. You know, that's absolutely immoral to do that to someone. I signed a pledge that said that no matter what happens, if I get to Washington, D.C., I will vote no against any bill I don't have time to read. I will also tell you that I'm one of those people that can count until I can add. I never thought that was going to be one of the requirements we'd be asked to. As a young kid, I used to say I can cipher. But when you recognize we have people in Congress that the word trillion doesn't mean anything. My personal financial philosophy is that you live according to your means, and you do that which is morally responsible to future generations, and don't leave them a legacy of debt.
Thank you, Frank. Now, Dave.
Congress needs to be able to say no. They should have said no on health care. They should have said no on the stimulus, but they didn't. They should have said no to the Obama policies of borrow and spend and borrow and spend and borrow and spend. I'm very hopeful that the next Congress is going to be filled with people very much unlike the current members of Congress who are there today. I think that's one of the reasons that we're all running. This is a very special year. You understand there are some years where we really struggled to find a candidate in this congressional district, even though it's a Republican district by registration. And so I think it certainly says something that is healthy about our democracy, that we have 4 people here today who are willing to take on the challenge. So I mentioned it earlier. We understand this is not going to be an easy race. In the Senate, my first committee chairmanship is not a traditional committee. It's a cost-cutting committee. We met again this morning looking for ways to stretch dollars within the Department of Corrections. There are 2 senators on that committee, 1 Republican, 1 Democrat, and 8 people from the private sector. So I think we have to understand that all of the answers can't be found underneath the Capitol dome. It's certainly not true at the state level, and it is equally untrue at the federal level. I would think that we could mimic the Grace Commission put into place under the Reagan administration. I think that we need to look for every possible way to begin to reduce federal spending. Perhaps some of those programs that have been on the books since the 1920s or the 1930s made perfect sense when my grandfather was 10, but they no longer serve their use and purpose. And I understand, it's very difficult to wipe out a government program once it's begun, but I think we can all come up with a couple in our head that should be defunded. I believe that's an appropriate role for the next Congress.
Thank you, Dave. And Josh.
Yeah, there's 3 things at play. Number 1 is the federal bureaucracy, which is an albatross around the neck of this nation in terms of productivity and costs. Number 2 is the budget, and number 3 is the principles that, as an elected official, you bring to the budget process. As a former civil servant who used to work in Washington as a federal regulator, I can tell you that waste is rampant. The amount of waste in Washington and the bureaucracies is staggering. I can tell you so many stories that would just, maybe they wouldn't shock anybody anymore. I don't know. Of watching people waltz in at 9:30 in the morning and play on their computer until 11:30, and then go have a nice 3-hour lunch with their friends and return back at 3:30 in the afternoon and hang around for a little bit with their buddies, have a cup of coffee, read the Washington Post, and go home. Day after day after day. These people were paid with money. I saw it. It's one of the reasons I left Washington. I couldn't take it. It was completely inconsistent with my values, my upbringing, my goals in life. So that civil bureaucracy has got to be brought under control. The civil service rules, we've got to be able to sever people who are lousy and unproductive. We've got to be able to let them go. There should be no reason that you get a civil service job and you're in for life. The budget process is driven by, obviously, a lot of different political forces, not the least of which is the urge to be reelected. If we can have people willing to either turn themselves out or force congressional term limits, then the urge and the desire to have earmarks, which bloat our budgets way out of shape, will not be as strong, because people will be willing to take risks because they're not afraid that they won't be reelected. And I certainly have the right principles, and I think all of us here do, to go to Washington and be willing to take the risk based on what we believe.
Thank you, Josh. And Ellen.
Okay, the question was for me to give you my personal financial principles and then tell you how they might be translated into the national government. I love to do that because I like to talk about finances. Some of you young people, here's some things maybe you can get hold of. Number 1, recognize that nobody owes you anything. And if you refuse to work when you can, then you don't deserve to eat.